Your attention, please, everyone. I think we'll begin. So thank you for joining us. As some of you know, I am Samuel Goldman. I'm the Executive Director of the Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom and an Associate Professor of Political Science here at George Washington University. I am acting on behalf of my colleague Marlene Morel, who is unable to join us, and who is co-sponsor of this event, which is a production of the Loeb Institute in partnership with the Illiberalism Studies Program. This is our second event in a series of conversations about the past, present, and future of the various and sometimes contradictory ideas, institutions, and practices that we call liberalism. It's our goal in these conversations to have civil but also incisive discussion among critics and defenders of liberalism who are interested in different ways in groping forward on the path toward a more satisfactory and perhaps more sustainable political order. This afternoon, I'm pleased to be joined by Adrian Pabst and Laura Field, who will share their views, I think, on a variety of subjects as the conversation continues, but I think we'll focus in particular on issues of economic order and also identity politics. So at my right, physically, if not politically, is Adrian Pabst. Adrian is an academic and author who has written extensively about constructive alternatives to liberalism that draw on philosophy, ethics, and anthropology. He is professor of politics at the University of Kent, deputy director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and holds visiting appointments in France and Australia. His latest books, he's written a lot of books, are Post-Liberal Politics, published in 2021, and The Constitution of Political Economy, published just last year. A columnist for the New Statesman magazine, he also writes frequently for both the UK and international press, including The Critic, Prospect, and Le Figaro. On my left, again physically, if not politically, is Laura K. Field. She is a scholar in residence at American University and a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center, as well as, I read here for the first time, a new associate at GW with the Illiberalism Studies Program. So, welcome to both to GW and to the stage. Originally from Edmonton, Alberta, she studied political theory and public law at the University of Texas at Austin and has held faculty appointments at Rhodes College, Georgetown, and American University. Her academic work has been mostly on Rousseau and Nietzsche, but since Trump's election, she has been writing about the crisis of liberalism and rising authoritarianism around the world, for the New Republic, Bulwark, and other publications. And she's currently working on a book on the American New Right for Princeton University Press. So this is my favorite kind of event, which is one in which I don't have to say very much. My role here is to act as moderator and pose thoughtful and yet challenging questions that will allow me to nod sagely at the responses. So I'll invite Adrian and then Laura to offer some opening remarks of 10 to 15 minutes, then I'll pose some questions, and finally we will give you the opportunity to weigh in. So once again, thank you for joining us, and Adrian, you have the floor.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for your warm and generous welcome. It's very, very nice to meet you, and indeed Laura. Very nice to be on the same stage. And thank you all for being here and for giving up your Super Tuesday, or at least the anticipation of what I think seems to be pretty much a done deal, but let's see. I really want to say a special word of thanks to Marlene, who has not only assembled a wonderful range of speakers and produced this incredible handbook, but also I think just brought so much energy and enthusiasm to the whole program. And I think these sorts of programs are much needed in the academy and beyond, because I think they bring together very important conceptual, intellectual work with also some very practical applications, really trying to force us to understand better what's going on and what potential political and policy responses might be to the sort of patterns we're seeing. So I really want to commend her and her whole team on that work, and I was very honoured to be asked to contribute an essay on the three phases of post-liberalism. But before I turn to the three phases of post-liberalism, let me say something about the three phases of liberalism. And I want to start by saying this. It seems to me that politics at the moment, here and across much of the Western world, is small. And it's inversely related to the scale of the task. You know, we're seeing a concentration and centralization of power and wealth, thinking governments in conjunction with finance and big tech, and we're seeing a commodification of everyday existence. So arguably, what is going on is that our societies are being eroded by both state and market power, societies that find themselves at once more atomized and more authoritarian, and in which 20 to 30% of people are doing quite well, and some of them extremely well, whereas the sort of remaining 70 or 80 really struggle to get by, and increasingly are sliding into precarity and worse. So we have this paradox that we're living in rich economies, and economies are getting richer, and yet we have more and more poorer people. But not just in a material sense. You know, people don't just face dispossession, they also face an increasing loss of purpose and meaning. And you could say, and perhaps it may sound flippant and provocative, but you could say that whilst overall, you know, for so long we've been used to, you know, higher living standards over time, better health, more economic security, none of these things that we seem to be taking for granted in the post-1945 era are all true anymore. So much so that today, arguably, Wall Street and Silicon Valley are on steroids while millions die of opioids, and that is an incredibly worrying situation. Now, I would never ever lay this at the feet of just a single political movement, party, or tradition, but I do think that contemporary liberalism has much to answer for, because I do think it has been the single most influential ideology, certainly in the last 30 years or so since the end of the Cold War. So when I say contemporary liberalism, the first phase of liberalism, what do I mean? I essentially mean, structurally speaking, a combination of social progressivism, the idea of, you know, ever greater emancipation and liberation based on individual rights. I mean essentially a form of free market economics with more or less government intervention or regulation, but on the whole a trust that the free market is going to deliver mass prosperity, and an interventionist foreign policy, you know, where the export of democracy and human rights is essentially guiding decisions about whether to intervene militarily abroad or not. And whilst, you know, that isn't all bad, and there are certain things that need to be respected here, including the attempt to build on the legacy of the civil rights movement and attempts to address real structural inequality and racism and discrimination. It nevertheless begs the question as to whether this progressive contemporary liberalism has essentially been guilty of overreach, whether it has extended freedom to the point where actually it brings about unfreedom, whether perhaps this ideology of free choice can flip over into something rather more sinister, especially when we think of tech platforms and when we think of unfettered market power. Now, in some cases, and perhaps at the most extreme end of the spectrum, there's even a sort of tendency to buy into post-human ideas, where no longer history, geography, or biology are really seen as realities, and where the human will, you know, unconstrained by anything, can now reign supreme. Now, that is not true for all contemporary liberals, but I think there are some developments in that direction, and I think we need to be extremely skeptical about that. Now, if you don't like contemporary liberalism, then perhaps you prefer classical liberalism. And quite understandably, there is, perhaps more to celebrate in classical liberalism. I mean, who, after all, isn't for some form of individual autonomy, who isn't against absolutism, and who isn't for greater self-determination. Except, of course, the philosophical basis on which these ideas are defended is perhaps rather more problematic. Whether it's Hobbes's absolute state sovereignty, or Locke's idea that we are essentially, as human beings, characterized by self-possession, and that self-possession is, in some sense, the fundamental mark of our human nature. Or whether you think, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill had it right when they were arguing for some form of greatest happiness of the greatest number, right, based on some form of individual liberty. All of this, I think, is problematic to the extent that it accepts or makes two fundamental assumptions I think we need to question. One is that the individual is somehow primary. That there's a primacy of the individual over all other forms, be that groups or communities or nations or other forms of association. But linked to that is this idea that the highest form of freedom is negative freedom. That only freedom defined as the absence of constraints on the ability to choose, except for the law and private conscience, is somehow the greatest value we can aspire to, I think needs to be questioned just as much. Now that takes me to the third phase of liberalism, because there are liberals, or at least thinkers that can also be described as liberal, who don't accept any of those premises and still hold on to certain principles of liberality. Now, when I say that, I have in mind thinkers such as Montesquieu, Tocqueville, and Burke, but also the new liberals in England, namely T.H. Green, L.T. Hobhouse, and L.A. Hobson. And I think what all of them have in common is that they actually believe that the individual is fundamentally embedded in social relations, that you cannot put the individual above and beyond society in all its complexity, that the social embedding of the individual is what in some sense provides the framework for any kind of self-determination. They also all believe in different ways in intermediary institutions, that we have institutions that mediate between the individual on the one hand and the state and the market on the other hand. And I think those are important liberal arguments. And I suppose I would simply say they're perhaps not exclusively liberal, because some of the things I've mentioned are sort of liberal and conservative in some way, or mutualist. But clearly there's a liberal element here which I think needs to be recognised. Of course, that is linked to defence of constitution, representative government, and a number of other important ideas and institutions that I would want to acknowledge as part of the broader liberal tradition. I suppose the final point I'll make on liberalism before moving on to post-liberalism is this. Liberalism has no doubt instituted and given reality to a number of important values. Free courts, free press, a mixed constitution, all the rest of it. What I would say, though, is that the fundamental principles that underpin all this, whether it's that of mixed constitution or that of the separation of powers, or indeed individual rights and notions of freedom, are not things that liberalism, of course, ever invented by itself. They're things that liberalism inherited from antiquity and the Middle Ages, and then, in many ways, extended and defended and renewed. But I think it's important to question this implicit assumption that somehow liberalism has a monopoly on liberty, or on all the other things I've mentioned. I don't think that's the case. Liberalism, like conservatism, like social democracy, is a modern ideology, or a modern political tradition, if you like, and therefore, of course, is only the inheritor of things that came before it. It absolutely did not invent those things at all. Now, I want to move on briefly to post-liberalism in the remaining 5 minutes or so that I have. Only to say that I think often post-liberalism is associated with illiberalism or anti-liberalism. And that is, I think, both real but also unfortunate, because there are certainly two strands of post-liberal thinking that I don't endorse, and that I have critiqued, namely in that contribution to the handbook. But there's also other post-liberal thinking I think is very much worth debating, just because it actually escapes both liberal assumptions but also illiberal or anti-liberal tendencies. Now, the first two strands I have in mind are the Natcons and the Catholic integralists. Now, like some of you perhaps in this room, I have many Natcon friends, and indeed many friends who are Catholic integralists, but to both I say that they're not really post-liberals. The Natcons are anti-liberal when it comes to social and cultural issues. They essentially want to reverse a lot of the things that have been achieved in the last 30, 40 years in terms of individual rights. And that isn't just to do with abortion, it goes a lot further. And when it comes to the economy body, they still think the free market is the thing that matters. They just want to give it a greater protectionist defense. They kind of think that globalization is a bit of a threat to America, that free trade hasn't worked out so well. But when it comes to the domestic economy, it is still very much about the market, individual, private property, and all of the things that free market fundamentalism rests upon. So I say to Natcons that they're anti-liberal and ultra-liberal both at once, which I think explains some of the tensions and contradictions. And if there is a coherent form of Natcon politics, then I would simply describe it as market nationalism. So I think that's what it amounts to. Now, I have somewhat greater sympathy for some of the Catholic integralism, only for the reason that I think it has a interesting critique of liberalism, and also I think is more interesting when it comes to some of the economic questions, or at least it gestures into some interesting directions. So the whole question of, what do we do with the dignity of labour? How does labour fit into our economy? Is it just to do with the knowledge economy and the sort of managerial class, or actually should we value things like vocational and technical work and training? How can we give workers a much greater say in the way that businesses are run, in the way that economic prosperity is distributed, and so on? So I think there's a gesturing towards a different economic model here. But I think where the Catholic integralist project simply doesn't work is that it's not entirely clear that you'd want to bring about a confessional state. Even if you think religion can play an important role in the public sphere, in public debate, as I also think it does, I think confessionalism is actually a very un-Catholic idea. It is also not an idea that would in any way, I think, command majority support. And the other thing I think that doesn't work with Catholic integralism is that it ultimately sort of stops at the national border. It invokes Catholicism and the Catholic Church, but somehow thinks that this is essentially at the level of nations, and that there's very little that can or should be said about the international. So the idea that somehow you'd want to confine a new political, economic and social model just to within any national border, to me seems a little strange when you're also invoking Catholic universalism. That then brings me to post-liberalism very briefly. I think there is a strand of post-liberalism that escapes both the limitations of and failures of liberalism without necessarily making the mistakes that the Natcons or the Catholic integralists make. And that is essentially post-liberalism that is to do with the human person rather than the individual. That is to say, with the notion of relationality, that we're born into relationships, whether that's the family or community or indeed nations, but also into relations with the natural world. And that relationality is the fundamental mark. And this isn't a purely metaphysical point, this is absolutely what anthropology shows us everywhere. That human society is made up of relationships rather than contracts or transactions, and that relationships are in some sense covenantal in that they are intergenerational. They link us to the people who came before us, as well as, of course, the present generation and future ones. It is this idea of the partnership, as Burke said, right, between the living, the dead, and the yet to be born. And in that sense, relationality is the most fundamental mark. And the other thing that marks us out is that we, as human beings, often associate around shared ends. that we are not simply governed by rights or by utility, but that we actually pursue shared ends together at work, in the community, in the family, and indeed as nations and as peoples across borders. It's the shared ends, it's the transcendent shared ends that actually bind us together, often around notions of dignity, around notions of common purpose, and that is something which isn't captured by liberal social contract theory, or indeed some of the supposed self-styled post-liberals. Now, I'll just conclude on that. I think this thinking goes beyond the old communitarian ideas, because communitarianism is very much focused on this idea that the community is the central human institution, to which I think this post-liberalism would say, sure, but community can be also oppressive, can be limiting. Association is actually much broader, and it brings in notions of democracy and self-government, I think, more than communitarianism does. This strand of post-liberalism is very much concerned with new forms of social partnership in the economy. That means a certain reinvention or renewal of corporatism, absolutely not state corporatism, which is, fascistic or communist, or in any case totalitarian in some shape or form. Not the kind of market corporatism we've seen for 30, 40 years, sort of, again, the power nexus of Silicon Valley and Wall Street. No, a corporatism that is an ongoing negotiation between employers, trade unions, and government at different levels, with essentially some notion of the common good, meaning that we want to try and reconcile strange interests, try and bring capital and labour together. And we've done this, including during COVID. I mean, whatever else we can say about the COVID response, but at least forms of, furlough, trying to keep people in work rather than laying them off, and trying to help businesses through COVID, that was a form of new social partnership. And if we can do it in emergencies, why can't we do it in other times as well? And finally, and I'll conclude on this, the post-liberalism I would defend is absolutely committed to internationalism. It does not believe in the absolute sovereignty of the nation state. While nations and peoples really matter, some belonging, politically speaking, the nation state is not only a recent institution, it's also one that has been often at the origins of the worst of capitalist exploitation, international war, and all manner of things. And in order to temper that, in order to balance national state sovereignty, we need a sense of international solidarity, not necessarily just at the level of law or organizations like the UN, though I think there's an important legacy here to celebrate, but certainly at the level of both mutual interests that states pursue together, and also social and cultural ties that bind nations and peoples together above and beyond national borders. So it's association, it's a form of new non-state, non-market corporatism and internationalism. That's the post-liberalism I would want to put forward. Thank you.
Laura?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. And yes, thank you to the Center for having me. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Helen. And Adrian. I'm going to begin with a little bit of praise, and then I'm going to go into a bit of blame. And then I'm going to, I guess, do a bit of propagandizing for liberalism. I'll do my best here. I'm going to do my best to disagree with Adrian, which is not so easy because I'd say he's the most thoughtful of the post-liberals that I've encountered in writing. Probably in person too. So I'm going to call maybe on Sam. I think Sam might disagree with the two of us a little more than we disagree with each other. But I do have some disagreements. So, and as I said, or as Sam said, I'm working on a book right now about the new right. So the post-liberal Catholics that Adrian mentioned, as well as the National Conservatives, quite a bit about them. So that's one of the reasons why I'm reading Adrian's book, which is what I did to prepare for this, was so refreshing because this is a different kind of post-liberalism. I mean, it was just really refreshing to read something that's so constructive. A lot of my work has been really critical, and it's obviously a lot harder to put forward a positive vision of something, so I really enjoyed that, and it got me thinking in all kinds of new ways. And it was also just refreshing to read something from across the way, that wasn't so mired in the American pathologies. So I wanted to begin by saying that. And there's just a sort of generosity of spirit in what Adrian's doing that I would highly recommend you read some of his work. there are all kinds of phrases that I would like to lift from his just way of approaching politics, and I think he's right that there's kind of a thinness to our politics and to our conversations. And so he adds all these, they're common from some political theory, but it's, just all of these ways of speaking that I think can sound somewhat, what would they say, cringe. But where there's an emphasis on civic renewal, intermediate institutions, I've got a long list here. The remoralization of politics, an emphasis on the dignity of work, new ethical forms and ways of value creation. I mean, his way of talking about economics is really different. But you can see that in other strains of post-liberalism, and I think that's also where it's most exciting. He talks about the renewal of ancient virtues, family policy, all of the reweaving the social fabric. I mean, there's just a lot here that's really rich and really important, and I just totally agree with. And I think at bottom what he's talking about is a new kind of politics that is sort of earthy and grounded, and he talks about how politics has to start with what people value, right? Family, friendship, locality, community, and country. These aren't things that we hear enough about in our politics. So I really appreciated that, Adrian. I wanted to start by saying that I benefited from your book. Your post-liberalism is my favorite. It's just really healthy and sensible. It's a good antidote to a lot of what we see in our politics. And I think there's just a really good roadmap here. I mean, I have a lot of disagreements with some of your characterizations of things. But the final part where you're talking about policy, I know the book was in 2021, so maybe you will be on this now, but just a lot of the policy ideas are really rich, really thought-provoking, a little pie in the sky maybe in terms of where we are here in this country right now, and maybe there too, but I'd be interested, maybe we can talk afterwards about how that looks to you, how it's different here versus in the UK. All right, so with that said, I'll say a little bit about why I reject post-liberalism, and I mean especially in an American context. And perhaps this has mainly to do with semantics and how the word has been, as you sort of noted, co-opted, at least here, I think, almost entirely by the National Conservatives and the term itself by the post-liberals, right? The Catholic integralists who include very thoughtful people, Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, Chad Pecknold, and Gladden Papin are the four who have this post-liberal order substack. And then there's sort of Sohrab Ahmari, who's sort of in it and not in it at the same time. And I think that the reason I reject it is because of some of what they've been up to, which is, I mean, when I look at the whole world of the new right, they have done very little to repudiate the uglier parts of that. Sohrab is the exception, and he has written a little bit against some of that, but they haven't. The rest of them haven't, as far as I can see, except for, Deneen had a couple of tweets, fine, about, didn't like the Longhouse article and the first things, and so, but I think that's really important. I think that they really haven't done anything. I think it's a really scary situation on the right here today, sort of the MAGA right, and they haven't really jumped all in, but they really haven't done much to distance themselves from that, and I think that's something to really be watchful of. And then they've positively embraced the Viktor Orban regime, so far as I can tell, and I think that's really troubling, and they're constantly minimizing the anti-democratic and anti-liberal character of that project. And Adrian, to his credit, doesn't do that, just to be clear. And so the final thing that I disagree with, which I think is sort of the deeper thing, and less sort of a pragmatic political concern, but with the post-liberals here, is that I think underlying their political vision is a rejection of ethical pluralism, a very well-grounded rejection of ethical pluralism philosophically speaking. They have their reasons, they have deep theological and political, philosophic reasons to reject it, but I don't reject it, and I think it's a huge mistake too, and I think it's a practical mistake in terms of modernity. So you can see that in Vermeule's common good constitutionalism, and you can see it in Deneen's ideas about replacing the elites and so forth. And I think it's very clear that if they could gain power, they would immediately try to end contraception. I mean, I don't want to, go on, but they would, put an end to abortion across the country. I think they would put an end to gay marriage, absolutely. And so these things I find really troubling, and I don't think there's much room there for disagreement about deep ethical matters. And I think a liberal society, I'm not arguing for freewheeling absolute choice about everything, but I think that they're rejecting some fun, and they would I think they'd be perfectly willing to admit that they reject ethical pluralism of the kind I embrace. So those are and you don't do that either. I think your work, Adrian, doesn't do that. It's very sort of forward-thinking about pluralism and ethics, and so, but that's why I reject the term. So I guess, so I'll move on to my third stage where I'll defend liberalism a little more positively. I think we hear a lot from the post-liberals, and there's a bit of this in Adrian's work too, about how the sort of decrepit state of liberalism, how it's dead and dying or moribund, failed, aged, right? And I mean, I look at our politics and it's pretty hard to disagree, right? There's a real sort of stagnation. The establishment of both political parties, the old establishment of the Republican Party has some problems and is gone now, and the Democratic establishment, I think, leaves a lot to be desired. But I think that if we just agree that liberalism is failed, we're kind of jumping the shark, and that we should change our perspective, and I think a better way to think about it is that liberalism is still young, if we're honest with ourselves. Liberal democracy is young. The idea is pretty old, right? It goes back to early modernity. The American founding was a long time ago, but it was only, I'll go through the list briefly. 100 years ago roughly is when women got the right to vote. The Civil Rights Act, 1964, that's 60 years. That's when sort of affirmative action started picking up, so you get some major shifts in our society, in our culture. Gay rights, 2014 was when same-sex marriage was passed. And so I think these are really dramatic changes culturally. I don't want to minimize that, but they're new. They're relatively new. It's not been that long that everybody had the right to vote. And so I think we should think about liberalism as something that's struggling still to be born, that's new, that doesn't quite know itself yet, that doesn't understand itself yet, doesn't know how to articulate itself yet, and certainly hasn't explored the full parameters of what it is and what its possibilities are. And I mean, I really liked your third phase of liberalism, I guess, the more communitarian part way of liberalism is, I think, a better definition, but I think that just thinking about it a little bit differently is something that's still young, even that if it's a bit of a mind bend, I think it's truer. And so, I guess I'll say a little bit more about what I think liberalism is, apart from these rights that have been gained. I don't think it is what Deneen says it is, and I think, Adrian, I think I disagree with you here too a little bit in terms of the foundations, the metaphysical foundations of liberalism. Of course, individualism is an important thread of liberalism. Deneen talks a lot about the conquest of nature. These are important parts of our liberal inheritance, but I think it's wrong to think that the philosophers of liberalism were engaged in a super serious anthropological effort, even though there's some of that in there. I think that it was partly, they were working through new ways of thinking, and they were really wanting to open the space up against a very stifling variety of political systems. So I don't think that I don't think we need to be wedded to any Hobbesian anthropology. But that's my own idiosyncratic way of reading the early moderns. But I think there's plenty of room within liberalism. I would argue for a much more flexible, experimental view of liberalism that certainly would embrace some of the social insights and anthropological insights that you mentioned. So for me, I would prefer a prosaic but also experimental sort of understanding of liberalism. But the prosaic one is that these institutions that matter, right? It's a way of, I think liberalism at its core is a way of allowing people to live together through difference, right? It's a method, I guess, of living together even in deep disagreement through democratically elected representative governments with the rule of law and individual rights protections, free press and open universities, and robust norms of religious freedoms. So I think and I think those things are very precious and not something that we want to get beyond, not something we want to be an afterwards relation to. I think we want to embrace them and hold on to them and sustain them. So those are the main reasons I don't want to, I think post-liberalism is a little bit dangerous, even just the word. I agree with so much of what you said, but I don't think it's a great project. But of course, listing these things that matter in liberalism is not enough. Critics are right that liberalism has survived largely off sort of the inherited fumes or liberal societies of other traditions, religious traditions and political traditions, republicanism, all sorts of things that we don't really take it seriously enough right now. And so I think it's time to reinvent liberalism, to rethink how we can sustain some of those same traditions within that broader liberal frame and to cultivate them. Which is why I think the work of Pabst and others like him is so important. It is liberal-minded, I think, but also free-thinking and creative, which I take to be liberal virtues. So I think that, just to conclude, I think that we need a rethinking of liberalism. Adrian's work takes us down that path, does some really good work. I would still incorporate it within a liberal framework. But I also think that right now we're in these really tumultuous intellectual times, right? And I think that we're in a position to be doing this work. Hopefully we can do some of it in time to not collapse into really horrible forms of political life. The First Things editor, R.R. Reno, talks about the return of the strong gods, right? He's got this book, which I haven't read, and I probably won't read, but there's a return of the strong gods, and I think that's happening, right? We've got these really tumultuous, really aggressive ideologies sort of doing battle. There's intellectual upheaval, there's frightening technological change, social media, and tons of uncertainty. In a way, though, this isn't so different, I don't think, from the tumultuous time in which liberalism was first conceived. So I think now it's a good time to re-examine the origins of liberalism and then to aim for a more capacious and communitarian and self-aware kind of liberalism or liberalisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Adrian, would you like to respond?
Well, thank you, Laura, very, very much indeed. And you've been more than generous about some of the work, and I think it's an interesting question as to whether we have ever had anything like a purer form of liberalism or not, or whether actually liberalism is still trying to fully emerge and define itself. Because I think for a long time it's true we've had essentially hybrids. I mentioned some of the thinkers earlier. Tocqueville, Burke, all the new liberals in England. And arguably, it was very, very hybrid because there wasn't a single philosophy or ethical tradition that defined their thinking. Burke is claimed by both conservatives and liberals, right? So therefore, it begs the question, right? And to say that he is only a conservative, only a liberal, wouldn't do justice to the complexity, to the depth of his work. So therefore, I think this hybridity is an interesting thing to bear in mind. And arguably even some of the more archetypical liberals, as we think about them in the sort of 20th century, like John Rawls. Rawls' doctoral thesis, which is not very well known, is all about the social embedding of the individual. So therefore, again, it begs the question as to whether even Rawls was a pure liberal. And, he's often mentioned as the typical sort of post-war liberal thinker. So there's that, but I think the hybridity goes further than just the individual thinkers and the influences on them. Arguably liberalism, as we've had it until very recently, was part of a culture that wasn't wholly liberal. For better or for worse, but it wasn't. Right? It was often, very much influenced by traditional religion and a number of institutions that couldn't be described as exclusively liberal. I suppose the argument I would be making is that I think liberalism cannot work unless it also has something that is extra to it. So that means you need a culture within which liberalism, I think, can play a role. But without that supporting culture, then I think it becomes harder to sustain. Because if you have a culture that sets limits on freedom, in a good way, because freedom without any limits often becomes a form of despotism, as we know from Dostoevsky and many other thinkers, right? That completely unfettered freedom actually turns on itself. You cannot have pure free choice, because it's the human will that has absolutely no way of making a decision about any competing good, and often it becomes essentially some form of will to power. Okay, and I don't think Nietzsche's wholly wrong in diagnosing that condition. So I think liberalism needs something extra to it in order to work. And I think the question is, if in the past that was, more a form of tradition and including traditional religion, what could that extra be going forward? Because I think pure liberalism won't work. Because pure liberalism, if we were to reduce it to its fundamental philosophical and anthropological assumptions, then I think it doesn't quite work. Because if you were to strip liberal thinkers down to what they really believe, they still believe in the primacy of the individual. I mean, it's very, very hard to get away from that. I mean, I'd like to, read a pure liberal thinker who doesn't believe that the individual reigns supreme. Right? And all the other thinkers are essentially more nuanced just because they're not pure liberals. So, whether it's Hobbes or Locke or the utilitarians, or indeed, ultimately, what Rawls's philosophy becomes once it's fully developed, is essentially this idea that the individual is autonomous and self-governed. And I think that does pose a fundamental challenge. But within a thicker culture, of course, self-determination, democratic self-rule is an important principle. But I think that's something which we already knew from some of the Greek and Roman philosophers. I'm not entirely sure how much liberalism adds philosophically. What it does do, it adds institutions and practices. And that is its achievement. But I'm not sure that philosophically we learn all that much from liberalism about what makes us human and what its fundamental principles might be. So I suppose my response is, yes, I would want to see all the things you mentioned in terms of coexistence. I would want to see a rich pluralism. But if we are going to see a rich pluralism, then surely there has to be space for traditions other than liberalism. Otherwise, it would again be sort of saying, we need liberalism to secure the pluralism, right, that we all want. That to me would put it again in a privileged position that I don't think it quite merits. But would I want to see a society or politics wholly devoid of any liberal ideas or liberal institutions and practice? Absolutely not, just because I believe in pluralism. I want liberalism to be one of the traditions. I just don't think we need to afford it any special privileges.
Adrian, I wonder if you can say more about the differences between the United States and the UK or Europe more broadly, because one of the things that strikes me in reading your book, like a lot of the work associated with post-liberalism, broadly speaking, is that it doesn't sound very American. And that's neither criticism nor praise, it's just an observation. It tends to appeal to a sort of underlying social consensus and to shared institutions that, for better or worse, are just much harder to find here. My line about this is that America is by no means exclusively liberal, but it does seem to be distinctively liberal. Themes of individual freedom, of limited government, are closer to the center than in most other places. So, again, this is not necessarily a criticism, but are there limits to what Americans can learn from your post-liberalism? And vice versa, are you saying that Britain, and again, maybe the West more generally, has tried too much to be like America in ways that have been counterproductive?
Well, thank you, Sam. That's an excellent question. And I think I would want to try and answer it by thinking about it in the following ways, which I think Europe and the rest of the West have often imported, not the best, but some of the worst norms coming from America. So whether it's, forms of consumerism or forms of corporate capitalism or indeed some of the culture wars or the identity politics in recent years, I don't think that that's the best of America. And I think what Europe and the rest of the West should have learned from a lot more is, I think, the more sort of civic Republican tradition in America, this idea of civic virtue, which I think is there and is in some sense as important, if not much more important, than the Lockean part of the American settlement, because I think that can be overdone. America was from the outset a kind of liberal Christian project. I'm not sure that really captures it. I think what's interesting is that actually Cicero is all over, the kind of the original thinking and the founding fathers in a way that I think Locke isn't. I mean, one of the reasons why Locke is cited and Cicero isn't is because everyone knew that, all the Ciceronian ideas, but didn't need to be referenced. Whereas Locke was this sort of strange thinker that was sort of imported into early America. So I think that Ciceronian sort of civic republicanism is the far more interesting tradition. But the other thing that America, I think, had and still has that Europe should remember and learn from is this idea of civic association. Right? And yes, of course, it's under threat. We all know that it's been hollowed out, and one doesn't have to wait for the work of the author of Burning Alone, whose name just escapes me. Pardon, thank you. And all the talk about social capital to know that these institutions and practices were being hollowed out. Of course, they can also experience periodic revival and renewal, and I hope that that's what will happen. But I think there are two things that I think the world, certainly the West, can learn from America. I think what can America learn from whether it's the UK or the continent? I suppose it is in part, this point about the culture wars and identity politics. I just do not think that there can ever be any winners in this. I don't think one can win a culture war or one can impose identity politics because it will ultimately be seen as exactly that, an imposition. I think the way to negotiate is to remember that there is no society if you have sort of a war in which there are winners and losers. You have to try and go back to what we are as human beings, which is we are storytelling animals. And there has to be a national story in which everyone can find a place. But not a story where, essentially some people will define what belonging means for everyone else. That's simply not going to work. And I think the legacy of a very racialized politics also is completely alien to most countries across the West. So there's lots there. And I think with the civil rights movement, America was going in that direction. And the civil rights movement is still, I think, in that sense, the most ambitious attempt, together with the New Deal, that is the most ambitious attempt to overcome a kind of laissez-faire economics. There were the proper American attempts to get there, but they haven't quite been carried through. And I think we're seeing the undoing of some of the achievements of the civil rights movement and the undoing of the New Deal. And I think that's the greatest threat to America. Because where America should go is, I think, renewing the New Deal and renewing the spirit of the civil rights movement. Now, that's easily said and not easily done at all, and I have absolutely no idea how it can be done, but I think they're the two lodestars that I think Americans would do very well to remember, partly because in Europe, where of course we had terrible forms of discrimination and racism and a legacy of colonialism and so on, I think that has somehow been achieved a bit more. And I think Britain, for all its terrible crises and its terrible current morass, and really a country that's perhaps in a downward spiral, what is true is that race relations in Britain are a lot better than I think they are here, and they're also a lot better than they are on the continent. So there's something about a certain sense of civic belonging that I think Britain has somehow brought about that I think is worth reflecting on. That's not perfect, but I think we are, as a young black writer, to me, Orwell has argued, this is not America. Race relations in Britain are of a completely different nature. So there are perhaps one or two things that Americans can learn from Europe and the UK as well.
I would be happy to continue, but I want to give Laura a
Can I
chance
ask
to
you a question
respond.
about post-liberalism? I think I agree with a lot of what you said. Maybe not about the foundations of liberalism, but that's fine. But I am curious just how post-liberalism operates in Britain, just because I don't really know. Is there also is there a wider group of people who you work with, and is there a left post-liberalism, or how does it pan out? How is it different, and how do they relate to the ones here? If you don't know.
No. Look, thank you. And I mean, the first thing to say is that, you know, the number of people who would describe themselves as post-liberal in Britain is incredibly small. I won't give you the exact number, it would be embarrassing, but, you know, it's not exactly a mass movement. And I think there are both some interesting things that they have in common, but also some quite sharp disagreements. And I suppose the two movements, if one can call them that have surfaced in Britain that are both intellectual and had some political influence, albeit limited, are, I suppose, what we call Blue Labour and Red Tory. So ideas essentially to do with a critique of where politics and the economy and society were going after the financial crisis. Really. So this is what emerged within the years, 2008 to 10, which had a little bit of influence on some of the ideas in the early Cameron years about big society. I mean, much, I think, watered down by the politicians and ultimately abandoned. Some influence on the then Labour leader Ed Miliband, who sort of had an interesting take on, how capitalism was very predatory and really needed to be fundamentally transformed. But again, he never carried that through. But I think they were probably the two movements that made some, had some traction because they were questioning the sort of fusion of a very impoverished economic with a very sort of radical social liberalism, really leading to a kind of free market economics and a form of, sort of social atomization that was simply not serving the country well. I think now the debate's moved on a bit from those two movements to really trying to find ways of building coalitions within and across parties. And again, the numbers are small, but I think the influence is not completely absent because even political figures that we might not associate with, with huge intellectual depth and original thinking, are at least picking up some of those questions. So until recently, it was all about autonomy and free choice, and now, the Labour leader talks a lot about security, talks a lot about the need for recognition and respect. Talks a lot more about what makes, a pride of place, what makes for stronger communities, what makes for, a more resilient country. And I would say this about the US as well. I think some of the economic ideas coming out of the Biden administration and some of the ideas that the Labour leadership have in part picked up from the Biden administration are getting us somewhere in the direction of a post-liberal economics. Right? Because it's no longer about the free market and free market fundamentals. It's not very much about industrial policy, it's about reshoring, it's about an economy that's more productive rather than one that operates purely on sort of speculation and finance. And it's ultimately about trying to build up state and industrial capacity, right, to be stronger in the face of all these shocks, including in relation to hostile foreign powers. It has broken with the mantra of free trade. Right, so I think there are some concrete developments here, but in terms of any particular party or any mass movement, though, it's still a very small group of people who think in those ways. I think the main disagreements with post-liberalism here would be roughly along the lines I've outlined. But then that also means that the post-liberal thinkers that we in the UK work with most are precisely Michael Lind and Sotomayor, because they have moved away from the culture wars, really to talking about what is the next political economy and how do we change the economic model so that maybe over time we can also have more cohesive societies, stronger community relations, a value of the family without imposing a single model.
Well, this is why I guess my skepticism about the attack on liberalism comes out, because I think I'm on board with pretty much everything you've just described economically, and the emphasis on choice and autonomy, I can see how rhetorically that takes more space sometimes than others, but can't these new economic models exist with still preserving people's basic rights to choose certain things, right, and to live their lives how they want? I guess I just don't see this. I think post-liberals often describe a world of limitless choice and autonomy, and it sounds like anarchy. And I don't think that's part of the liberal tradition, and it's an important part, and it has moral significance, right? And it's part of dignity, and it's part of moral freedom. And so that's where I'm quibbling now, right? But I think it's an important possibility that you can still have a basic commitment to not total choice, but nobody has total choice. We're all confined by limits, right? The material limits all around us, we die. I mean, we could get into transhumanism as the ultimate expression of liberalism, and maybe it is, but I don't think that's really how it is. And so I guess maybe my point is that we're stuck with hybridity, and that's good. But liberalism is never pure like that, and that's good too, but that it's still, I mean, maybe, I don't know. That's my quibble with some of what you said.
No, sure, and I certainly don't think that choice or freedom of choice or some form of negative liberty is all wrong and should be abolished. Absolutely not. But I think the question that we need to ask, and I don't think liberalism asks enough, or enough liberals ask, is what's the end? What's the finality of this? Because if it's choice for choice's sake, frankly, that is not going to give people economic stability or meaning or anything.
Yes.
And the moment we bracket teleology out of the court of public discussion, there is a huge problem. And I think Alistair McIntyre in that sense was right when he said, in After Virtue, the problem is that we have bought into both emotivism and some form of basically positivism, where now shared ends cannot be named because they're seen automatically as somehow oppressive. Well, I think shared ends can actually be paradoxically very liberating. And I think the problem with choice taken to its conclusion is that we are then, actually much more limited because it's now a consumerist culture, which ultimately is a form of social Darwinism in which most people don't do well. Mm-hmm. And the only people who do well are a very, very small elite. So the problem with the language of choice is not so much that it isn't important, but the next question is who has choice? To your point, not everyone has choice. Mm-hmm. And often it's the most vulnerable, the poorest, right, who don't have the choice that the powerful, the wealthy, and the healthy do have. Yeah. So it's a social Darwinism, I think, that we're bringing back, by having too much focus on choice and not enough about what are we trying to achieve here. Individually and together, of course. The common good is not something which, I or any other post-liberal should define for the rest of society. But I think one thing that is important is that we hold in balance, more than we have done, individual fulfillment and mutual flourishing. Yeah. Because people ultimately are not fulfilled in some form of isolation from others. Very, very few people flourish in conditions of isolation, by which I mean, a lack of relationality. So if liberalism can recover a sense of the common good and flourishing and hold in balance the individual and person with other forms of social reality, then that's fine. It's when liberalism generally think that it is ultimately down to the individual alone and that other things are, if not impositions, but really constraints that we should do away with. The family is always oppressive. The community is always going to deny you autonomy. The country, is going to, curse you. I mean, not that that isn't true in some sociological sense, perhaps, but it's to try and get a sense of, can we not value bonds of belonging as well as make sure that people are not oppressed and exploited? And I think it's the balance that liberalism is.
How do we find our way to that agreement? Because it strikes me that at a certain level of abstraction, it's really not too hard to find terms that we can all accept. And I think that was really the outcome of the communitarian liberal debates of 30 or 40 years ago, which reached sort of an impasse when it turned out that the liberals weren't saying or claimed not to be saying the things that communitarians attributed to them, and communitarians weren't really willing to restrict what they acknowledged as fundamental freedoms. And beyond that point, there was nothing to argue about. The conversation had reached consensus. But the problem, it seems to me, is one pointed out by Michael Novak, who was a liberal as he saw it, but working within non-liberal tradition. And what Novak said is, look, at an appropriate level of generality, of course, everyone is for social bonds and the embedding of the individual. Nobody really thinks the things that you're suggesting they do. I don't think even someone like Locke did, but again, that's sort of boring, a boring objection. The problem is when we have to make them concrete and it comes to trade-offs. So, when it comes to the economy, everyone wants abundance and shared prosperity and low prices and domestic employment and a whole list of things that if you polled them, I think you would get 75% approval. The problem is you can't really have them all at the same time. And political dispute arises when we have to go beyond abstract agreement and set priorities. And for Novak, the liberal position was that ultimately only I can set the priorities for myself. Which doesn't mean that I always get what I want. We have a political process that has to aggregate preferences, and sometimes I'll lose. But the fundamental claim of liberalism, as Novak saw it, was that you can't tell me what I really value. And if, for example, again, keeping it simple and concrete, low consumer prices are more important to me than domestic manufacturing, that is not inconsistent with some grand conception of the common good. That's simply my view, which I am entitled to pursue in politics and to the extent I can in my own behavior. So all of this is a long-winded way of saying on panels and in books, it's often not that hard to find agreement, but it eludes us, or seems to elude us, the more concrete and specific we become.
So, absolutely we need to recognize the reality of trade-offs, and absolutely we need to recognize that people as persons should be allowed to make decisions and come to judgments without anyone or any institution telling them exactly what is good for them or what to think. So that is fine, except the question then is, how do we come to these aggregate decisions? And are they truly reflective of a majority, or are they often much more either reflecting certain ideological positions or vested interests? And the problem is that it's hard to argue that over time, the sort of pursuit of low consumer prices at the expense of domestic manufacturing is a good thing for the majority. Because you look at wage stagnation, you look at precarious employment, you look at then dependency on potentially hostile foreign powers for all sorts of things that we now want to import, albeit that they are cheaper than if we manufacture them at home. That is not, in any sense, in the medium to long term, a good thing for majority. It may again work for certain social, classes, certain professional classes, certain sections of society, but is it really in the interest of a majority? That is a big question. The same again as we said earlier, who can actually exercise choice and autonomy? And if the starting conditions are, by nature, such that, not everyone has the same level of wealth, health, education, and so on. If the starting point is one of radical disparities of decision-making power, of wealth, of social status, then it's very hard to argue that our current institutions are such that we still come to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. I just think that itself begs the question, because arguably the economic system we've brought about in the last 30, 40 years, the sort of society we now live in, has not served a majority very well at all, by any objective measure, be that life expectancy, which is now either stagnating or in reverse, health inequalities, left, right and centre, income and asset inequality, forms of social cohesion that we know people also depend upon for a sense of stability and security. We can go through all of the metrics and see whether actually a majority has benefited from the dominant model. And I think we'll find that in most Western countries that is not the case. So fine, let's absolutely talk about aggregation, and let's talk about the importance of individual choice or individual judgment and discernment. But I think it would be people would be very hard pressed to defend the dominant model as one that has worked in the interest of a majority, or indeed, if by the common good we mean ultimate flourishing of everyone, no one can possibly say that we have got very close to that. Now, I'm not saying that therefore everything that we've achieved in the last 40 years is wholly wrong and should be thrown out. But whether it is an emphasis on negative liberty and individual rights only at the expense of positive liberty, at the expense of a sense of duty and obligation, whether there's a sense of balancing free trade with domestic industrial manufacturing capacity, whether it is foreign wars, right, that have cost the taxpayer trillions, and left us perhaps more exposed in the world and with our moral authority that we might have once had in tatters. I think it's very questionable whether these things have really been to the benefit, and whether it's not the case that a much smaller elite, both old establishment and new managerialism, has actually benefited disproportionately. I'm not one to say, the elites are all to blame and, let's abolish the current elites and replace them with some better ones. I think that's a, very dangerous path that sounds, almost Maoist, which, I don't think is where we want to go. But it is arguably the case that a combination of an older establishment, an older moneyed aristocracy, if you like, with a new professional managerial class is disproportionately influential in society. And, and you can ask, majority white communities, majority Hispanic or black, African American communities in this country, or indeed other communities elsewhere in the Western world, and it's, you'd be hard pressed to find that they think this is working.
So, just very briefly, and then I'll open the floor to questions. There again, I think it's important to be specific, because there are, I think, some issues where it's fairly clear that elite has become sort of a nefarious term as establishment. But the preferences of a relatively small group have been imposed against pretty consistent popular resistance. I think immigration is probably one of those. But there are others where I don't think that's been the case. And just to, again, keep it concrete, American voters have an extraordinarily strong revealed preference for low prices. The reaction to inflation just in the last few years, I think, is evident to that. And you may well be right about the long-term implications of that. But I'm skeptical of the suggestion that that a sort of cohesive social model has been imposed against the wishes and better judgments of the great majority of the population. Again, on some issues, I think there's a pretty strong case that's true, but there are others where I don't think that's accurate. But enough from me. Let me open the floor to questions, and I will simply ask that you identify yourself before saying what you have to say.
I'm Stuart from the Quincy Institute. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I have a question for each of the speakers. The New Deal liberals, who call themselves liberals, like Mark Liller and Thomas Frank, and perhaps Michael Lind as well in his way, who have sought, well, certainly Frank and Liller, from within the Democratic Party to recall it, to get rid of some of the cultural politics and bring it back to a New Deal model with conservative social features. How different would they be in the end from your position? Mm-hmm. And insofar as there is a difference, is it one which here in America is to some extent being imposed by an ossified political party situation? In other words, people are trapped into rival political clans, increasingly mutually exclusive and internally disciplined, who in a different political system would actually agree with each other. And a question, liberalism has always been obviously an ideology of growth, economic growth as well as of progress. There is, and there have been intervals where that hasn't worked, and of course, in a number of terrible examples, liberalism collapsed as a result, taking democracy and civilization with it. There are many indications now that this kind of the historic Western growth of the past 150 years or so, over the whole period, cannot be sustained in the future. Can liberalism survive without it?
Thank you so much, Anatole. Again, great question. And I mean, personally, I've learned a lot from the works of Mark Liller and Thomas Franks and Michael Lind. And I think the New Deal was a bit like what we said earlier. It was very hyped. It wasn't a purely liberal preacher. But there were clearly liberal elements to it. And I think it's perfectly fine to acknowledge that the New Deal is not pure liberalism, but also to acknowledge that it owes something important to liberalism. And in that sense, I think, because of that hybridity, it is an important legacy to not just reflect on, but I think to try and renew, albeit in an environment that is perhaps almost as difficult, if not in some respects, more difficult. And I think, I mean, I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of any of the three, but my sense is that perhaps Lilla and Franks, a bit more than Michael Lind, still identify themselves as fundamentally liberal, albeit that they are not signed up to the more contemporary forms of liberalism, since they are, they put forward some very, very powerful critiques and also ways in which that liberalism needs to renew itself and evolve. I think that one of the reasons why I find Michael Lind even more interesting than the other two is because he consistently makes the argument that whereas liberalism seems to now be so signed up to identity politics and the free market and so on, he on the whole prefers to think of the alternative to that and indeed to demagogic populism on the right. He thinks that the real alternative is what he calls democratic pluralism. And that, I think, is a powerful argument, not least because there is a whole tradition of pluralism. Again, whether it's in England or here in the US or in other countries, pluralism is its own political tradition, and perhaps one that we should retrieve and renew for our age, rather than thinking it has to be conservatism or liberalism or some form of social democracy. So perhaps pluralism is that fourth political tradition. Not that I want in any way mirror the language of Alexander Dugin. He has no monopoly on the idea there might be a fourth political theory, so perhaps I can, in the spirit of competition, put that forward as a fourth political tradition. But the point is, I think democratic pluralism really has a lot of, as yet unrealized potential. So that's, I think, how I would see some of the differences between them. But yeah, absolutely, the New Deal as a way of getting beyond let's say, fair capitalism without in any way going down the road of sort of statism and communism, I think remains a very important achievement. Very much in the spirit also of Catholic social thought. And this is, I think, another tradition that is worth reflecting upon because it itself builds on a very strong pluralism, rather than a kind of philosophical monism or dualism. So there are some traditions here that we can work with, and I think they're richer than perhaps some of the other ones.
And party ossification?
Yes, no, absolutely. I think the problem is precisely that the parties in different ways have, I think have sort of, in really quite strange ways, I think politics has become virtual. It sort of flees reality and seeks solace in abstraction. The will of the people is somehow, if that is a given that we can observe. I don't know what that means, the will of the people. It either means mob rule, which I find truly frightening, and we've had examples of mob rule far too often in recent history to underestimate its dangers. Or else is a sort of rarefied, I think what the majority want and I'm going to now claim to govern in its name. I find all of this stuff terrifying. But I think, just as you have the will of the people on the one hand, I think with technocrats you have the sense in which they really think they know better and they can make decisions on behalf of millions. And when that is linked to very powerful interests like Wall Street and Silicon Valley in this country, or the City of London in the case of the United Kingdom, I think we are in danger of undermining democracy. And because democracy then doesn't work, people start losing faith. They start longing for some form of order and strong rule and strong man who can then provide that strong, and that's very dangerous. In the UK there was a very significant survey done by a think tank called Onward in the year 2020, where it turns out the 18 to 34-year-olds already thought democracy wasn't working, that Parliament was essentially dysfunctional, and that they were hoping for a strong leader, perhaps a military person. Would you believe that? In the 21st century, young people signing up to a military leader to get us out of the trouble we're in. So, there's a lot we need to do to rebuild democracy. I don't think either liberalism or conservatism in their current configuration can really do that job. Hence, we need other traditions and other movements to try and do this. Where are the mass membership organizations? Trade unions, churches, friendly societies, all the civic associations that still exist, but by God, they're not in a great shape to help us save democracy.
please.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, the question to you.
Well, that's okay.
Sorry.
So there's economic growth and liberalism. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like there is a deep connection between some kind of capitalism and liberal modernity. And Locke, I mean, well, we're being hard on Locke today, right? But Locke, you read about, I think that those early modern thinkers really wanted to pitch economic sort of generative activity as something that could work against religious fanaticism, is the sort of very quick version of what they were sort of doing at the deepest level, is that they thought if you could create new forms of ambition, trade, commerce, that these things, you see this in Federalist 10 too, right, that it's a way of deflecting energies away from some very harmful and destructive passions into other forms of activity. And plenty of that was also very sincerely interested in innovation, right? Interested in science, interested in the potential for the relief of man's estate. And so I think it's a really good question whether we can have liberalism without endless growth and innovation. I think probably we need to. Just thinking about environmental concerns, we have to find ways that where growth looks different. Sustainability is much more the emphasis, or closed economic systems. I'm not an economist, so I don't know. I mean, it all sounds very, very hard, but I think it involves things that Adrian talks about, creating different kinds of value in the economy. And then I think there's just so much right now that's just run amok finance and Wall Street activity that is not meaningful. I think that people who are inside some of those systems, some of the people I'm writing about came from that world and just became so deeply cynical about it. And so I think that that's pretty poisonous and needs to change. And obviously, so I think it needs to. I think maybe where the challenge here is that it cuts against democracy, because people love growth and love their stuff, and it's like we all love that, right? And so I think at this point we have to be willing to kind of sever or not sever as much, too strong, but to acknowledge that in politics there's a difference between aggregate interests and the common good and what is good, and we have to be willing to have that conversation. We need to cultivate leaders that can persuade mass populations that their interests are not what they think they are, because they've thought it through more, right? Some ends are more valuable than others. We can think about this as human beings. We can plan strategically for the future. But that requires a huge change of sort of orientation in this country, that's for sure. So, I mean, that's all very, very difficult, but I think that it kind of gets at what Sam was pointing to as a real problem in democracy.
Yeah, hi. Heidi from GW. I wanted to get a little more specific and concrete. When you were describing your idea about corporatism, I was starting to think about another country already, and that would be Germany. And I wanted to know to what extent your vision would differ from what we have in Germany, not we, but what Germany has at present, which would be, for example, representation of workers at shareholder meetings. You have some social policies that are linked to the Catholic tradition, such as women can stay home for the first 2 years during the life of their children, during which time they will get paid, plus they will get Social Security. They are considered to be active members of the economy at that particular point in time. You have high respect and good pay for those who participate in the vocational system. And even if you're a foreigner and there are local elections, you have the right to vote. So that also creates a kind of sense of community. So you have all these other, you have these kind of elements that I think you have been talking about. And my question is, to what extent does your vision of post-liberalism go beyond what I just described?
Well, to be honest, if one could, adopt and adapt some of those institutions that exist in Germany and other countries, I think it will be for the better of those countries. So I think that's a very, very important starting point. Whether it's the importance of small and medium-sized businesses, regional central banks, co-determination as you described it, parental leave and everything else. Absolutely, I think these are key institutions that do something that is lacking in other economies, namely in the UK, I suspect as much, if not more, in the US, and that is they try and value things that should not be reduced to some status of commodity. You know, they value whether it's, you know, mothers, and indeed, of course, nowadays we have shared parental leave, even in the UK, so, you know, if there's parental leave, for instance, what many couples now do, that is that the mother takes the first 6 months of paid leave and the father the next 6 months, because then there's also not as long a career break, and, you know, so there's all sorts of ways in which one can adapt these institutions. But the fundamental point is that it gives status to labour, it gives status to persons, rather than treating everything as essentially commodity in exchange of market price. So yes, those post-war institutions are really, really important. I suspect, knowing what I know about Germany, where in fact I was born and my family is from, even if I have now been in England for much longer, is that it's under stress and threat from some forces, be there, you know, the forces connected with the Eurozone and some of the, you know, the EU laws that don't, I think, necessarily support institutions like those enough, as well as, of course, developments in the global economy, you know, all the changes since the war in Ukraine, you know, in terms of you know, having to import energy at much higher prices, not having the same export markets in China, all the rest of it. So I think the model is clearly you know, under some considerable pressure, but absolutely I think it's a very good example. Interestingly, there was some British economists involved in creating it. So there's economists from the so-called Oxford School, like Alan Flanders and others. And when they returned to the UK and tried to introduce some of this as well, it was actually voted down in part by the trade unions. Trade unions in Britain were far more militant at that point and didn't want co-determination. They saw it as some kind of compromising and wouldn't work with the capitalist class and all of that. So clearly that was to the detriment of the British model. And whenever it's tried to have anything like a proper industrial democracy, it's not happened. So yes, absolutely, I think those institutions are a great starting point. I guess the next question is how do you keep them strong, and how do you renew them for the age we live in? So, for instance, what do we do about tech platforms? You know, do we just leave them and say, well, you know, there's nothing we can do, they're so powerful, you know, they're essentially private monopolies and there's not much that anyone can do about it? Or do we think of them as public utilities over time, right, where maybe private providers can compete for services, but it should actually be public infrastructure, not state, not controlled by government, but a public utility? Should we not think of water and energy and so on as public utilities? You know, the railways, could we not run them in much more neutral or mutualist ways? So I think we need to extend a lot of those institutions to other parts of the economy to really have a kind of robust corporatism that can serve the economy well in the world we now inhabit. But yeah, I think post-war Germany is probably the most ambitious attempt so far to try and embed markets in social relations, but also not to concede all of that power to the central government, but to also really apply subsidiarity so that local government and regional government you know, are involved. And it isn't all a matter of you know, the current party in power in Berlin.
So we have time, I think, for one more question, and Julian, you are it.
Julian Waller, professor here at GW. I have a question on your views on the relationship of liberalism or post-liberalism and democracy. I'll ask it in two distinct ways. To Laura, to what degree is your understanding of liberalism, which feels quite thick, relatively speaking, there's a lot of sort of progressive components to this with liberalism, and so on. How central is this understanding of liberalism, this practice of liberalism, necessary for democracy, or is any sort of variation thereof, or degradation, or move backwards, a threat to democracy? I bring it up because you mentioned how post-liberals are dangerous. You said that multiple times. They're dangerous, the anarchons are dangerous, they're dangerous. Well, in principle, in democracy, sometimes your side doesn't win. So, to what degree is sort of the thick understanding of liberalism necessary for democracy itself? And to Adrian, I suspect, since you have a different conception, and you talked as well about democracy being a part of the post-liberal idea, are there specific institutions that are lacking in, say, the liberal democratic model that might exist or want to be reformed and reframed in a post-liberal democracy? What does that look like? What does that mean? How would you think about that? Thank you.
Well, I don't want to reject democracy. I think it's really important as an institution within liberalism, but I'm sort of an old-fashioned constitutionalist, not in a conservative sense. I've got my own complicated way of thinking about constitutionalism and sort of constitutional change, but I don't think sort of unbridled democracy is a very meaningful political organization. So I think the liberal parts of liberal democracy, I think both parts of that, that's my phrase I prefer to use over liberalism, just because liberalism has such a fraught and meaningless sort of connotations in the States, and it's different in Europe, and it's so complicated. So I just think liberal democracy is a good phrase. It preserves both the kind of liberal institutional developments and also the commitment to individual dignity and sort of equal rights that is there, that is part of sort of a democratic commitment. So, I mean, I guess to me it's just, you don't want democracy without a liberal superstructure. I don't think, I think then you've got kind of something that easily devolves into mob rule or whatever. I mean, I'm sort of old-fashioned that way. Thank you.
So I think a lot of the recent debates have focused too much on formal democracy, not enough on as well, substantive democracy. And I think the first thing to say that, a fully functioning democracy that isn't just formal with periodic elections, but actually has a democratic culture and ways of generally giving, as Martin Luther King would say, making people partners in power, that sort of system, I think, has to revolve around the sense of representative government. That is, in some sense, a far more interesting and important question, and whether we are, fulfilling the sort of formal strictures of democracy or not. So I think representative government at all levels, and in the UK, as well as in other countries, I think local government has been decimated and actually even destroyed. And I think not in the US to the same extent at all. You have a more functioning and functional federalism, but I suspect there are also upward pressures, and obviously there are concerns over the sort of overreach of federal government, whether it comes to certain responses to COVID or other things. Again, is the federal government robust enough in relation to certain vested interests, like tech platforms and so on? So representative government is really, I think, at the heart of this. But then democracy needs to be properly extended or even introduced to areas where I think it's currently not strong enough. I mean, we mentioned the economy, right? Where's our economic democracy? Is there genuine democracy in the workplace? Do workers really feel they have a say in the way that either private or public sector organizations are run? I don't think so. And I think in order to do that, we need tripartite arrangements. We need, to find a way of giving funders a third of, if you like, of votes, if it is votes on management boards and so on. We need workers to have a third, and we need effectively users. There could be patients in hospitals, parents and pupils in schools, passengers when it comes to the railway. We need to make sure that there is a proper negotiation between those estranged interests, because at the moment it tends to be dominated by one of them, often effectively the funder, which often is then either the state or the market. So we need proper economic democracy around notions of dignity. We need local democracy where it doesn't exist, but also internationally. I mean, where is democracy between nations? I don't think we can possibly claim that the United Nations is run in a particularly democratic way. Now, people say it's impossible. Right? With all the autocracies and authoritarian regimes around the world, we can't have that. But nevertheless, I don't think we should give up on it. I mean, one very concrete thing that we should be doing is we should be insisting in any trade agreement that we sign that free and democratically governed trade unions are, allowed in those countries. Hence, when we do trade deals with countries such as China, that should be one of our requirements. Right? As a concrete example, because that would be giving proper status to workers in China who currently aren't being given that status, whatever the Communist Party may claim. Right? So there are all sorts of things we should be doing. The International Labour Organization is a very important part of that institutional ecology, but who's talking about it? Have you heard Western government talk about the ILO, what it should and shouldn't be doing? Absolutely not. It's an afterthought of that. So let's think about labour, let's think about workers, and let's think about democracy in a fixed, substantive manner, not just, looking at, whether a country holds elections or not. Because however important elections are, however important the peaceful transfer of power is, that is really not the essence of democracy. It is an important part of it, but I wish we could be talking a little bit more about what makes a substantive democracy. And I think liberalism, in some of its contemporary expressions, is very much on the side of formalism, not on the side of a kind of realistic and also a substantive democratic culture.
And on that note, I'm afraid we have to conclude. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Adrian and Laura for their comments. We will continue with these events. I don't think we have another one scheduled for this semester, but we will continue in the fall, so stay tuned on the website or by other means. Good evening, everyone.